All right, hello everyone. Eric Marks here, findingmiddleearth.com. And today I'm going to talk about a weird comparison that a lot of people try to make sense of. And a lot of time it's one of the most misunderstood things in photography. I'm going to talk about ISO performance versus image stabilization and image stabilized lenses. Okay, so I get a lot of emails, obviously, questions from a lot of you guys, and I love answering your questions. And when I get 10 or 15 emails of the same question, that's when I typically make a video about it, because it's much easier to just let everyone know. Clearly multiple people are struggling with this issue, and so I wanted to kind of put this to rest now, because it can be confusing if you don't really think about the outcome of this. So let me put you in a scenario here, okay? Let's say you're a photographer that often shoots events, or you often find yourself in situations that are very low light situations, okay? So you shoot in low light often, or you shoot in very tough lighting conditions. You have to be kind of versatile, and you have to have versatile equipment. So I've heard so many people, even at camera store employees, I've heard so many people recommend cheaper camera bodies to event photographers and say, you don't really need the ISO performance if you get nice stabilized lenses. So if you're shooting a wedding, these things, you can shoot these things at a 1/10 of a second, and they'll just be, the images will be tack sharp. Well, I want to throw up when I hear these camera employees saying this stuff, because it's such a misunderstood subject because of this misinformation that is given so many times. I want you to think about something here. Let's think about the kind of the IQ of this situation, okay? If I'm shooting a moving subject at a 1/10 of a second, no matter what lens, regardless of what camera, anything, okay? Because a 1/10 of a second is a 1/10 of a second, no matter what camera you're on. If I'm shooting something at a 1/10 of a second and it's moving towards me like a bride and groom, or maybe walking to the altar like a bride and groom would, if I shoot that at a 1/10 of a second, very slow shutter speed, then they're going to be a motion blur, because any kind of a moving subject at a 1/10 of a second is going to be a motion blur, a streaked blur. You're not going to be able to freeze the motion. Think about it. Think about a slow shutter speed versus a fast shutter speed, right? For sports, you want a fast shutter speed, right? Why? Because you want to freeze the motion. You want to freeze the sports players. If you're shooting football, or if you're shooting basketball, when they're jumping in the air or running back and forth, you have a very fast shutter speed. So it just freezes them in what they're doing. It freezes your subject. Image stabilization doesn't do that for you, okay? Image stabilization comes into play when you're shooting in low light at stationary subjects. So for example, I recently went to a museum where it's very low light in this museum, and they don't like big cameras coming in there anyway. So I just brought the X-T2 and the 18 to 55 kit lens, okay? And I was able to shoot some photos that were sharp at 1 second, okay? Now I was, being as still as I could. I was controlling my breathing, and these image stabilized lenses from Fuji are incredible, but my subject wasn't moving. It was a stationary, showcased item at the museum that was just still, right? So I'm still, the subject is still, and the image stabilization is doing its best to try to mitigate my issues of handshake. That's all it does. The stabilization, the image stabilized lenses don't do anything to your subject. The whole purpose of a stabilized lens is to try to mitigate your stabilization issues, your handshake and your breathing or whatever. Its whole issue is trying to control the photographer. The shutter speed and the ISO performance control the subject, how the subject gets portrayed. Okay, so think about that. A 1/10 of a second stabilized lens, it's only going to be sharp if your subjects are stationary, okay? Now, Nikon and Canon have these too. Nikon calls it VR, which is vibration reduction lenses. Canon has IS lenses, image stabilized, okay? So a lot of companies have these stabilized lenses, but don't let misinformation fool you into thinking that you can just go with a camera that has crappier ISO performance, because you're going to be able to get the stabilized lens and you'll get tack sharp images at weddings by shooting a 1/10 of a second. It's not true. So I had to just put that out there, because I hear it, it's a very misunderstood subject, and I just want to help people along. So, but how can we kind of make sense of this? Okay, well, think about it. If I'm at a wedding and I'm on, let's say, an f4 lens, okay, and I'm getting too slow of a shutter speed, well, then maybe instead of stabilization, you want to think about a lens with a larger aperture. So for example, this lens here is the 56 1.2 lens by Fuji. And this lens, I feel comfortable, more than comfortable shooting in low light with, even though it's not stabilized, because I know if I need to, I can go down to 1.4 and 1.2 and get a fast enough shutter speed to freeze the motion as much as I need, because I'll just make it a balancing act between the aperture and the ISO performance. But if I have this 1.2, 1.4 aperture, then I don't have to crank that ISO up so much, because I'm letting more light in with the aperture. But the image stabilization isn't going to let any light in. It's not going to do anything to my shutter speed. It's not going to increase or decrease my shutter speed. It's just going to try to stabilize me as a photographer when my hands are shaking or when I'm breathing or moving. That's all it does. Okay, but the aperture and the ISO and the shutter speed, those all control how the subject is going to be portrayed to the camera. So think camera settings, not stabilized lenses. It's all going to be based on your situation, obviously. If you're shooting weddings and events and stuff, stabilized lenses are great, and you should use stabilized lenses because that's still going to take care of your handshake issue. I'm not saying don't use stabilized lenses if you're an event photographer, but I am saying that that's not going to do anything to your shutter speed. So still be conscious of, getting a camera with decent enough ISO performance to be able to crank it to 1600 and 3200 and still look good. Because it's really a balancing act between all these things. Stabilized lenses aren't going to fix your issues, because that's how a lot of people make it seem that, well, it's okay if you can shoot on ISO 200 the whole night at this wedding and you can just stabilize your shots and you'll be good. So yeah, I wanted to clear that misinformation up. Stabilizer, it only affects stabilizing you as a photographer. It doesn't do anything to your camera settings. It doesn't increase or decrease your exposure value. Whereas your ISO and your aperture do. They increase and decrease your shutter speed all over so that you can get that perfect shutter speed to freeze motion. For example, if I'm shooting a wedding, I'm pretty comfortable at 125th of a second to 200th of a second if I can be. That's kind of the sweet spot that I like to stay in. And I'll use a stabilized lens as well. I'll use a stabilized lens and an ISO of about 1000, maybe ISO 1250. I don't like to go over 16, 3200 if I don't have to. And then I'll crank the lens at a 2.8 or whatever the biggest aperture I can stay at. And then I have my 125th of a second, 200th of a second. And think about it. 200th of a second is much faster than a 10th of a second, right? 10th of a second is something like this. Click, click, and then 200th is snap. So that way it just freezes the motion. It freezes the bride and groom when they're walking to me or whatever subject I'm shooting in this low light event. I hope that helped. So if you guys have any further questions about this, let me know. And I'll be happy to answer them in the comments. I just hope this helped, because typically when I get 10 or 15 emails about the same issue, which I have in this, I like to just make a video because multiple people might be dealing with the same decision, trying to decide between stabilized lenses and good camera settings, when really it's all kind of a balancing act to go towards getting a sharp photo, essentially. So, I hope this helped. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. If you would like to stay up to date on all of my latest photography videos and adventures, click the big subscribe button below. And if you would like to find out more about me and how to become a great photographer, visit my website at findingmiddleearth.com.